Hi, my name's Chris. This is the Camille Corp, and today we are talking to the author and creator of the Edge of Midnight project, which is historical fan fiction detailing the entirety of the Federation-Klingon War. So don't go away. We'll be right back to talk to John. So I thought we could start out and just have you talk a little bit about the Edge of Midnight project, kind of how you got started doing this, and just kind of let you give a sales pitch, and then I've got just some questions if you don't mind answering some of those.
Sure.
All right.
The one I've got, if you lived in TNG and you went back to your dad for Thanksgiving and he was reading a book, he's reading The Edge of Midnight. That's the sort of pitch, if I had to pitch it to a Trekkie. To be a bit more long-winded about it, it's a work of Star Trek fiction written like an academic history. So, for those of Trekkies and fans who've read things like Starfleet Technical Manual, TNG Tech Manual, it's in that same sense of I am writing about the Klingon Cold War and the politics of the 23rd century as if the rules of the universe apply. So it's not quite a novel, it's not quite a reference book. It's more like I want to know and to convey to the readers what's actually going on in the background of the original series, Discovery, Strange New Worlds, the original series films that makes them tick along. If the original series films are, let's say, Band of Brothers, I'm writing the big, thick history book of the Second World War that helps explain what these people are doing in this place and why. And it's there's a lot of books that have been written like it in the past, like, Dave Goodman's Federation First 150 Years is sort of the big inspiration,
Sure.
which was done about, that's 10 years old now. But other things, obviously, like the TNG Tech Manual, Franz Joseph Tech Manual, a lot of the old stuff for the FASA RPG in a similar vein, but a lot of that has been very, for lack of a better word, it's either been very light touch to be like, ooh, we're going to mention this topic and not go into it, or it's been very sort of hard-nosed in the sense of, we're going to tell you everything about the USS Enterprise, and I like that. But I also want people to think about, okay, what does it look like to try and run the Federation? Why is it difficult? What does it look like to try and run Starfleet or the Klingon Empire? And what does it look like if you are just somebody trying to live your life between these two things during the Cold War? Because everyone we meet in Star Trek is largely part of either Starfleet or a similar force from another species. So we don't really know what the politics is, because these are people in a professional situation getting on with their life. And, for various reasons, we don't know how Kirk and Spock and Picard vote, but I kind of wanted to think about that. And to put sort of historical context to it in a big air quotes.
Yeah, so, and you touched on this a little bit with the technical manuals, but what I've always enjoyed, even as, a 14-year-old kid, was reading either the Franz Joseph technical manual or Mike Okuda's TNG technical manual, right? Because they're written as if they exist in that universe, and that's something that just really appeals to me.
Oh, absolutely. And they obey what I think is the perfect rule of all sort of world-building writing, which is, this thing happens on television, and we can hand-wave it away as happening on television because it's television. Or we can figure out why it is in a way that leads to other conclusions. So, famously, Okuda and the others basically try and put a number to how long it takes to build the Enterprise. and why there's so few of the Galaxy class, and it makes the ship feel bigger when they put the numbers out in front of you and make you think about how long it would take to build it.
Yeah.
In a way that Franz Joseph started doing when he basically went, this is actually how big Star Trek the Federation is, and it's huge, and that's why we don't see any other ships. And even though the rules TV's given you changes, you sort of abide by the same thing with a sort of hint of the rule of cool on top as well.
Well, and you touched on a little bit. You said world building, and I've done some world building for other projects and things like that, and it's a massive undertaking. So, how do you keep all of the threads straight in your head, right? I kind of I picture like the conspiracy wall with all the articles and the photos connected. So how do you
it's
keep
not quite a
everything straight?
conspiracy. There's three basic threads, which is one, there is a Google Drive full of spreadsheets and notes and lists, which have, some people when they world build, they make, Tolkien, the first great world builder, used to put all this stuff in the books. I don't put that in the book. That's for me. But that's how I keep track of it. The second bit is kind of, I know where things have to end. I know that I've got the Klingon Empire of Discovery at one point, and the Klingon Empire, the original series, is a middle point, and the Klingon Empire of the Undiscovered Country and TNG is an end point. So I know where I've got to go, which is really, really important world-building, that I have these hard crunch points. I have to do Errand of Mercy, and I have to do Wrath of Khan and Search of Spock, and I have to do the Undiscovered Country. So everything's got to slot into those. And quite frankly, it's also held together by the rule of cool, which is so many senses. I have plot threads, and they're just like, okay, well, I could go this direction and go along and do this complicated explanation for why I need the Klingon economy to fall apart. Or I could just look at history where stupid stuff happens, go, yeah, I'm going to pull that. So for the Klingon economy falling apart, I just went, well, some random person we've never heard of before pops into the historical narrative because he stole all the money and ran away. Which is something, if you read history books, this happens all the time. I think that's underestimated a lot about historical study and historical research, is that a lot of people only appear in the narrative when they do something that fucks everybody else off. The most obvious example of that is that the most vital sources for a lot of historians are court records. You want to know what life is like in the especially early modern world, so early colonial America, early modern Europe. You look at the magistrates' records, because that's this big document of people screwing up, and that usually means when somebody screws up, there's a lot of documentation. So that's what pops in. But so many of the threads, sometimes as well, don't really go anywhere. And sometimes that feels bad, but it's also that sometimes the thread that doesn't go anywhere is the most interesting part of world building, because not every piece of history has a neat ending.
Sure.
Some of it, and the great advantage also of writing in universe is you can basically have the author go, I don't know the answer to this. So one of the best parts of writing the early part of Edge of Midnight is season 2 of Discovery, of course, ends with everything being the whole spore drive and Discovery being classified. And that leaves, you can argue, that leaves a massive hole, because they're this really pivotal part of history at the time. They win the Klingon War, and then you have the crisis, the control crisis. But because it's classified, I just basically have the right to go, I don't really know what happened here. And history, would have been very different if Sarek's adopted daughter had lived, and the Discovery had lived, and maybe, Cornwall had lived. But because he can't know the answer to that, the author doesn't know that that about Una, the full story of Una and Algorithms. He just knows that Una got off despite breaking the rules. The author doesn't know that, that Section 31 is.
Sure.
Which is great, because I don't like talking about Section 31, so I can just go, well, he doesn't know about it, he doesn't think it's real. But also mean that because it's in universe, I don't have to explain what happens to the Organians and why they don't keep enforcing peace. I could just go, well, we don't know. It just kind of happened. And dwell, I think, on the more interesting question, which is why, how did it take so long for people to notice the Organians are gone, and what happened next? Because I think so much of a lot of big Trek writing and world building, it's like, ooh, can we follow this thread down this? How far can we pull this thread that other people have already pulled? You know, I don't really want to know more. I want to write about the Klingon augments and why they look different.
Sure.
What I want to know is why Kang, Kor, and Kolos are three completely different kinds of person in the same military, and why the Klingon Navy in the original series is so their uniforms are clean, their ships are very crisp and modern, and why they're not 15 years later and 15 years before. That's a bit more interesting to me than why they didn't brown them up for TNG. It's like, well, we know why they don't have forehead ridges, and they tried it on television. It's also not particularly interesting. There's more interesting discussions, I think, of what Klingons are than thinking about the makeup and the biology. I mean, that's also because I have a bias. I don't have a pedigree, an education of biology. It's not of interest to me. The history is. I'm sure if, you know, somebody who is an expert in biology attempted the same project, they'd probably write something equally fantastic about Klingon biology, but that's your biases. And I do lean into them, especially in what influences the sort of world building I do.
So that kind of brings up another question. Like, reading through this, I mean, it's to me it's expertly done. So what is your background as far as writing history, things like that you've been able to just like nail the tone of like a historical analysis text?
Well, I mean, I'm a historian by trade, sort of working at a graduate level on imperial history and a lot on the points where empires hit each other. So looking at like Africa and the Caribbean in the 19th and 20th century. So I read a lot of history. I read history constantly. There's a certain tone, especially to popular history, of trying to draw on narratives and keep people reading. I think an underestimated aspect of a lot of good popular history, you know, your Band of Brothers, to go back to that, your Bridge Too Far, is that they are history, but they're built like novels.
Sure.
They have a cast of characters, they have events, they have moments of tension, moments of quiet, moments of exposition. They're not just dry text. And if you spend enough time reading a lot of history over and over again, not only do you get used to the style, you get used to the commonalities of how certain things relate to each other, and how authors might start with a small anecdote to demonstrate an overall point. I mean, the start of Edge of Midnight is this inciting incident with a Starfleet cruiser coming to defend a colony and having to withdraw because it's completely outgunned and overstretched. And then an explanation of why that cruiser is overstretched and outgunned and how those aboard it felt about it. And that is a very common thread to sort of use a micro... It's not quite micro-history is what I call, but use an anecdote to make an overall point. But it's interesting doing it in this sense, because I'm making all of it up. You know, often historians can, you know, the anecdote is full of evidence, and they can pull off that. Whereas I've got to come up with the anecdote and the evidence myself. Which often leads to going into, you know, a lot of historians can hit nice boundaries where the evidence runs out. I don't. I hit boundaries when I get bored or when I realise I've written 20,000 words that nobody will ever want to read. There's a whole cut section of that first chapter which is just a discussion of Richard Daystrom. We'll publish it at some point. It's not great. It's not the greatest thing I've ever written, but it's this whole discussion of like why the data computer is so good. But it has no purpose towards the narrative, because when it started, it was a lot more about the starships. And the more and more I've got on with it, I've realised that the starships are sort of increasingly less important. Everybody loves a good ship, and a lot of the art has the ships in it, and that's Star Trek, you can't avoid that. But a lot of it's become more about what a ship represents and what the people on board a ship are on the ship for. So much so that sometimes I have to remind myself, I have all these great spreadsheets of ships. I have to go back to them and be like, oh, I forgot that I had done this. I spent this time on this. Because it's not... They just have become less important, which is always amusing, because the whole thing started originally as, like... The original idea was to do a study of the D7 v the Constitution as, like, these two dueling ships representing the two powers. But then it just evolved out of itself, and now I feel like I talk less about the ships every chapter I write.
So... I think that's fascinating, right? Because I think for a lot of people, who kind of grew up with the technical journals and the technical manuals, like that's what they like to sink their teeth into. And so I think, you said that it kind of started to be, hey, this is about the ships, and then it sort of evolved. And I think that what's kind of fascinating is that the history and like why things happened the way they happened is actually more of an engaging read, right? You said it can be, there's drama, there's characters, there's this intrigue that you get to kind of weave and construct, and I think that's really cool.
It's the thing, of course, is that Star Trek is about the ships, it's also about the characters, and there's a lot of me thinking, especially writing this bit, there's a lot of thinking, well, how would these people exist alongside the moralities and the plots of the period? So especially when I'm inventing new characters, there's always in this head of, how would this person exist within a Discovery episode, or a Strange New Worlds episode, or an original series episode?
Mm-hmm.
So, that opening character, one of the opening people we follow is a junior officer called Peter Toussaint. And I'm imagining him as a character on Discovery and Strange New Worlds. But as I write him, sort of from where I am onwards, he becomes more and more of a character on the original series. His attitudes to life change. How he speaks will probably change, because there's this sense in which I'm trying to write everyone as if they'll fit into those universes, to fit with how people understand the Star Trek. So, in that sense, there's a lot more people with sort of suspicious morality earlier on than there are by the original series, because tastes change. I mean, the exceptions to this prove the rule. Peter Broadhurst, the president I put in, who is just Alan Alda, has to sort of sit astride as this turning point between Strange New World and the original series. So he's very bullish, and he's very modern in demeanour and political attitude. But his principles are very, for lack of a better, Roddenberryan. He's evil. He just has decided he thinks how the world works, and he needs everybody to work that way. And that's the other interesting thing I always go by when I write it, is that I try not to let any of the characters slip into sort of, for lack of a better word, normal codes of morality, in the sense that the Federation the politics of the Federation and the politicians of the Federation have to be better than our ones. If they if they use the same venal tricks and are just as corruptible as our ones, they're not Federation politicians, in my view. There needs to be something better about them to make them feel different. That doesn't mean that they are perfect. It just means that they get caught up for different reasons. The obvious one being Everyone always has these discussions about is Starfleet a military, and if they are military, they're really crap at it. If they're not military, they're really militaristic. And the obvious point is that Starfleet is a bad military because it is responsible to civilian government that views our concept of a military as archaic and cruel and violent. Because the politics is different. And I'll never sort of say it, because the idea that there's something wrong with how the Federation's political society works is not something the author would ever comment on, because it's his society. So you would never catch a 21st century historian trying to tell you why a 17th century person would find the 21st century repulsive.
So, and you wrote something in the text, and you said, if we are to maintain this federation as a bastion of democracy, a beacon of hope amongst the stars, then we must, no, I say we need to act as more than a refuge for the masses. We must become an arsenal of freedom that can protect those who cannot be protected. And I think what that does is it really frames an answer to that question of, is Starfleet military or is it not? So I thought that was a really clever way of addressing that point.
Well, it's interesting because, of course, Thirahalat, the president who makes that speech, sits in the text as sort of a bit of an FDR figure of turning the tide away from despair. And also, I mean, in the tonality, he represents the shift from the sort of despondency of the Discovery era to the slightly more aspirational tone of Strange New Worlds, which I'm quite pleased with, because I wrote that before Strange New Worlds was announced. So I think I should, got some space to enjoy that.
Sure, yeah.
But I think it's interesting because I have had basically to figure out the politics of the Federation from scratch, because you're something like Babylon 5, where JMS took a lot of steps to make you understand how Earth felt about itself, how Earth understood itself, how Earth understood its position between the center and its colonies, and also what it was, the sort of its limits on violence and how fragile its democracy was. And the closest kind of Star Trek really gets to making you think about how fragile the Federation is internally ever, I think, is Journey to Babel.
Yeah.
Because in Journey to Babel, the stakes are high enough that Spock basically says, if this whole thing falls apart, there might be civil war. But also that you have that. And on the other hand, you have a Federation that otherwise appears quite robust externally. So I end up thinking a lot about how how strong or weak is the Federation as a union, which is how I ended up with this whole politics around reform and the colonies and representation, which is both an analogue for historical issues like the Great Reform Act, like the place of the American West, but also really for current time dissatisfaction with democratic institutions, in that they're good institutions, we should be proud of them, they're important, and they're the best option for representation, but they're not perfect. And that makes people angry, and that makes that the dissatisfaction of those systems drives them to demand reform, but it also drives many into dangerous radicalism, which will come up a bit more in the second book. And we see hints of that kind of tension in like little things that get mentioned in the original series that I've had you pull off, like in Amok Time, the Enterprise is going to a presidential inauguration on a planet which has just come out of a civil war. And Pulley says, well, why is Altair having a civil war? Well, maybe the Altair government looks at the crisis of a reform because we don't be part of the Federation, and that causes internal strife. And the sort of basically making the Federation feel weaker and not. It's been really important to make it clear how the Federation is not one big happy family all of the time, and how certain moments of crisis put pressure on that and cause problems and tensions that have long-lasting legacies. Things as simple as why do we see so many? Why is the Federation Starfleet dominated by humans for the rest of the century? You can say, well, there are aliens we don't see, which is what I say a lot, but then there's also, what does Starfleet do to undermine the trust of the non-human powers? Which is, how I end up borrowing from the Dreadnought book to have Rittenhouse as this sort of MacArthur stand-in, and that heroes trust in the Starfleet, and that has effects. I do a lot of borrowing. I think one thing I'm going to be a lot better at in the future is really, really making clear when I borrow stuff. Because I've had a lot of people go to me like, oh, what did you come up with Rittenhouse? Or, oh, it's a bit weird you named that character Rittenhouse after what happened. And I'm like, well, no, the character's 40 years old. And he's actually more nuts in the book than I ever made. Mm-hmm. But it's also interesting writing a character that is going to be a villain, and the audience knows going to be a villain, but isn't really going to portray any of that villainry. I don't need to signal in the text, oh, he's done something sinister. It's more, there's got to be enough in the text to go, oh, when he decides to do something really, really terrible, it makes sense. At no point am I trying to trick the audience. It's more that I need them to follow along and understand why he's going to do something bad. Which is very different to how I'd have to do it if I was writing this as narrative fiction. Because in narrative fiction, doing something like that, people might perceive as lazy.
Sure. So it's laying the seeds and the motivations for the things that everybody knows are going to happen.
Yeah, I think that's a lot of the work, is basically making sure that I've done something in chapter 8 or 9, that when something else happens in chapter 20, you're going, oh, okay. And, all writers do that. That's just how plot threads work. I think what's interesting, of course, is I get to basically go, this now will cause this later. Openly. Sure. Which is easier it's just generally easier. It feels like cheating sometimes. But I think it's fun it's a nice way to make audiences, make the readers. I've had this comment from a couple of people, is that it helps a lot of people get why historians link random things. You think, okay, this doesn't look like you contributed all to that, but it has these knock-on effects down the road. And, simple things like, I did a whole bit for the next chapter talking about Klingon haircuts, and how the fact that all the Klingons in the original series have very human, even Western haircuts. And that's a really important political signifier. That signifies this certain kind of Klingon political attitude. In a way that, skinheads or punks or other ideas people understand in the real world represent political viewpoints. But then it's gone. This is the other point. But then this kind of hairstyling is gone, just disappears. And that also happens in the real world.
And it's kind of interesting. It has to be interesting from your perspective of taking these things that just happen to be like cultural and societal things that were in existence when the series were filmed, and trying to wrap internal or in-universe concepts and meaning around them, right?
It's because sometimes you do and sometimes you don't. So I will never ever bother to try and come up with an explanation for the whole there are no female starship captains thing. Because it's just if I had to contrive a in-universe reason for why basically there was institutional misogyny in the 23rd century, I'd just probably end up giving up because there's no good explanation.
Right.
I remember the Star Trek Continues series had an episode that sort of touched it, and they basically went, "Oh, it's because the Tellarites are all bigoted," and I'm like, I think misogyny and sexism would be too far in the past. I can happily see the Tellarites or other groups being bigoted towards, augments, as we saw in Strange New Worlds, or other species, or I can see certain forms of bigotry, but not ones we would recognize as such.
Right.
But I could also see species being sexist. And that also affects how I deal with those period attitudes. I mean, the most obvious example is how I deal with the Orions, in that I basically threw the book out on the Orions, because you go and read all the FASA guides for the Orions, and it is all basically decadent Orientalism about these debauched slave traders and slave drivers who sell sex across the galaxy. And it's a bit like, that's horrifying. And also, it's also like, I don't want to write about that. I can't. It's not particularly interesting, because it's just not. So instead, I thought about it this way, which is we've only seen the Orions from Starfleet's viewpoint and from the Federation's viewpoint. And we've only understood the Syndicate from the Federation's viewpoint. And we're told that it's a society of criminals and gangsters and assassins who do everything by deceit and skullduggery, right? If you are in the 21st century or 22nd, that period, that is also how you would have felt about the European mercantile empires of the 18th century. That's how you'd have felt about the East India Company,
sure,
and the Dutch East India Company, and the slave trade as a concept, even though at the time, that's legitimate government commerce. That is good business, profitable business. In some senses, people would call the East India Company progressive business. During the abolitionist movement in England, it was considered socially progressive to buy East India sugar, which was caused just as much physical harm and violence as West Indian sugar, but it wasn't slave sugar, so it was considered progressive. So that's how I end up considering and writing the Orion Syndicate, is that it's, in their own heads, they're not a criminal gang. They're the East India Company. They're the World Trade Organization. They are the legitimate business interests of Orion. And it's these crazy Federation types who don't understand what commerce is, who are going around saying you're all breaking the law, where it's like, well, I haven't broken any law of my own. I haven't broken my moral codes. And which makes it interesting, because it's sort of, you turn this light on Orion society, immediately becomes more interesting, and you imagine it as just having a completely different moral code to ours, one that is recognized in our history, but is not built on basically Orientalist, racist pejoratives and very racialized ideas of gender and sexuality and sex. Instead, that sort of image we have of the Orion slave girl becomes about what the Federation finds most horrifying, which is, of course, slavery and sex slavery, because of course they would, because who doesn't? And what becomes most horrifying is how normal it is. But what the Federation misses in that is understanding that not everyone in Orion society thinks it's normal. Not everyone thinks it's right. Because the other rule of history is that you can look back to any period where people went, oh, everyone thought it was right at the time, and there'll be somebody going, this isn't right. Because that's just how society works. And that's why I have the whole thread about the Orion merchant, the Orion anti-slavery organization, and how they end up basically spying for Starfleet, because their attitude is this might topple the system down. And in the long run, they're right. By TNG, there is no Orion slavery is not something people talk about. Even though Lower Decks brings back the Orions, they're not really enslaved. They're pirates. They're gangsters. They're not slavers in a way that they are. In a way that a lot of material in the original series and in the original series beta canon, and in especially in the Cage, presents them as an entirety. Because I really enjoyed it when we went to Orion in Lower Decks, because it kind of ended up fitting my attitude towards Orion society, in that it's multi-strated and it has this immense landed aristocracy who probably have very little to do with with Orion piracy generally. Because it's just making them feel more less like a cartoon as a culture. Yeah. What's the line? The planet. They're not a planet of hats anymore. It's they fit into how this world works.
Well, and when you think about it, right? It's the Orion society that was depicted, previously, can be thought of as one facet of a society, of a culture, right? It's one industry, it's one group of professions, when there's this whole diverse other way of life that you just don't get to see on screen.
Yeah, and that sort of feeds into how I've interpreted the Klingons, because you've read it, you'll see I really don't like the idea of the Klingons as a pure warrior race. Right. I find it really boring. It's also just that's not how society works. It's not how culture works. I think there was a moment when I was putting together the first chapter of the Klingons where I was like, what if it's just a mistranslation? What if the Klingons just view it's not about physically fighting, it's just about struggle.
Sure.
I end up going all Shakespeare, going, they are the warriors for the working day about it. But it just suddenly means that I can have the Klingons, because some people, the only other person to sort of think about what this period would look like was, of course, the Great Starfleet Museum website, which, I sort of, if I could draw starships, that's what Edge of Window would end up like, but I can't, so here we are. But that narrative basically says the Klingons can't do trade, the Klingons can't do economics. And you don't develop an interstellar empire and wield power across the stars if you can't do economics.
If all you can do is fight, you don't become that influential.
Yeah, you can end up with essentially, for lack of a better word, barnacle societies, like the Packlets, who just basically live off of the wastage of interstellar society. But you can't become a dominant power if you don't understand how to balance the books. What you can, however, is that basically a society where those who are basically balancing the books and managing it all are not politically dominant. So the cultural output doesn't recognize them. But also, the other point, whenever people talk about, the Klingons are obsessed with honor and warrior cultures, every Klingon we meet is a soldier. If an alien and a nurse, and every person they talked to for 50 years was a soldier, they'd assume all humans were members of the military, and they'd bring them a very skewed opinion of what humanity was like. And it immediately makes, the whole honor. Once you start to basically say they're not a warrior culture, and it's not just about honor, the importance of honor in how we see Klingons becomes different. In that, is the obsession with honor we see in TNG normal? And I say I don't think Klingon society's always been like that. And then I get to why are they obsessed with honor? And is it because the only people they tried a lot of other stuff in the 23rd century, and it all didn't work? They try a sort of corporatist government L'Rell. They're going to try dictator or military central authority with Sturka. They're going to try a military junta, essentially, between TMP and undiscovered country. And then once they discovered all this work, what's left is, oh, well, the aristocracy haven't destroyed everything. We'll put the Grey Houses in charge again, properly. And it works. You know, it keeps the Empire functioning, but as Ezri famously says in Season 7 of DS9, it's not... The Empire's still dying, because it's just become obsessed with that ancient cult, with inward-looking honor culture, instead of trying to move forward with the world. You know, there are allegories there with, like, how societies dealt with the collapse of the Cold War and the War on Terror and afterwards, and that they become obsessed with the past. Yeah, I mean, speaking as a British national, I can tell you that's certainly what happened here in the last 70 years. But it's, I think, being able to make people understand that societies change, but also that characters and societies changing are not in the writing, are not plot holes, but in many senses, if they're explained well, positive plot points is quite good. It's why I was kind of disappointed with the presentation of the Klingons in the original series, because they don't, not in the original series, in Strange New Worlds even, because they don't feel like original series Klingons. They feel like they feel like TNG ones. They don't feel different. They don't feel like... The Klingons in Strange New Worlds don't feel like in 6 years they're about to invade the Federation. They feel like they've settled in for a Cold War. They don't feel like they're about to start a war.
Right.
I mean, they're not... I really liked... what was the first episode of the season 2? The one where they go to Kal'Jitar and they have the... there's a false flag. I like that as an idea, because it certainly explored what post-war would look like. But I just thought obviously I thought there was a lot of wasted potential, because I've been writing about this for nigh on 3 years. So,
and kind of along that vein, where, you know, we do have new series and new episodes coming out, and, you know, you've been working on this for 3 years. So, have you encountered a spot yet where, like, an episode of Strange New Worlds or something has, like, contradicted something you've written and you need to come back and, like, do a correction?
The Gorn thread, the Gorn plots have been very difficult. Because I was like, well, the Gorn aren't really going to be an issue till Festus 3, and then suddenly, no, they're not only are they an issue in 2259, they've been an issue well before that. And it's like, well, what does that mean for Edge of Midnight? So it's sort of, I have the obvious excuse, which is that the writer isn't writing a history of the Federation in the 23rd century. He's writing a history of the Federation and its relations to the Klingon Empire. So he doesn't have to, he can sort of, the Gorn enter the plot where I need them to be in the plot, and they can leave it afterwards. The only thing that would really, really screw with me is if in Season 3 of Strange New Worlds, the Federation goes properly to war with the Gorn, which I don't think they'll do. But it's the thing where it's also... I mean, the other thing that doesn't help is they've been really unclear over the dating of Strange New Worlds, whether or not Season 2 is a different year to Season 1, whether or not that's all taking place in 1 year or across 2. And I've just kind of... You know, Memory Alpha says... This is all getting very granular, but Memory Alpha goes for the 24 episodes equals 1 year, which means that both seasons of Strange New Worlds happen within 2259. I kind of like to say that Season 2 of Strange New Worlds happens in 2260, simply because it makes my life easier.
Well, and I think...
And it's a bit more interesting.
I think it's kind of, like, easy to compartmentalize and say a season is a year, too. I mean, I think it just... Mentally, that's easier for people to just kind of wrap their heads around.
Yeah. I mean, God knows, God knows. But I think it's the interesting thing with as Strange New Worlds has come out and moved on, I've sort of concluded that if the longer the show goes on and the further I get away from it, it's going to be hard to keep up. And certainly once I start hitting 2264, 65 into Organia, I will just leave it behind and it won't affect the narrative because it's kind of it's too late now.
Yeah.
But also, the nature of what Trek is being created right now, I don't think... It's interesting. Strange New Worlds adds certain things and certain concepts that I've had great fun with, like Kajatar, the Dilithium concession, and the Prospero and Admiral Dakra, which I've had great fun adding to the narrative and understanding where they fit in. But the nature of Edge of Midnight has always been that it's not particularly concerned with what our hero characters are doing. Enterprise features very rarely in the book. In fact, there's a contrivance in how I've organized Starfleet in that because it's on a 5-year mission, Enterprise is under a self-contained chain of command. So it's not only going to get pulled into a crisis if Starfleet's really desperate. Hence, the typical only ship in the quadrant.
Right.
Thing we get in the original series. When I get to doing the original series era, Enterprise being involved will make more sense because Starfleet has built itself to fight the Klingon on the one front, and the Romulans have returned, and it's been split across two fronts, and that's before we get into the Gorn and the Tholians, and basically Enterprise is at the front line so much in the original series because Starfleet is just overstretched.
Yeah.
But at this point, now, while Starfleet is overstretched in the Strange New Worlds era, in the Edge of Midnight narrative, it's also politically can't use Enterprise because people still want Starfleet to do the 5-year mission. They still want the exploration to go on. There's still a desire for Starfleet not to become a pure military, which means that there are politicians whose agenda requires Enterprise to go on a 5-year mission. Somebody like Admiral April has patrons who want him to make sure that Enterprise is delivering scientific success and exploration and supporting colonies and not going toe-to-toe with Klingons.
That makes sense.
Which means, and the long and short of which is that basically I don't have to worry, to a certain extent, I don't have to worry about what happens on screen that much. Even the Dakra... Funnily enough, the whole Dakra plot really was quite nice because it comes at this point in the narrative, if you put it in 2260, where relations with the Klingon Empire are sort of deteriorating to a point of no return. And a successful ambassador being killed sort of leans towards that, in that somebody who could have secured lasting peace is gone. And I wrote a little piece, a little interaction on the website between basically the president and senior staff over Dakra's death, which was great fun to write because it's basically, it's poking fun at the plot holes of the whole thing, but also at how also the leans in how Federation idealism could lead to you making a war criminal an ambassador.
So, yeah, okay, I see what you're saying.
Yeah, it's basic to cut a very long point short. I use what I want to use, which has always been the rule. I mean, basically... there was a way to build that narrative to talk a lot about the Control Crisis or the season 1. I had to radically reinterpret what the Klingon War meant for my own logic because they kind of didn't want to make you understand what the aftermath of the war would look like. So I had to make it impactful, but not in a way that would destroy the Federation, just in the sense that it's wrecked its politics and wreck Starfleet, but the actual Union is intact.
Sure, yeah.
But also that, despite the Klingons getting to Earth, they've not held anything. So they're feeling quite unsatisfied with the whole war. They have their war dead and their glory, but they don't have anything to show for it. They're not gone. The economy, they haven't made the Empire better. They've just made themselves happier, basically.
Yeah, no spoils, so...
Yeah.
So, one thing, and you're kind of talking about this a little bit, where it's like, the Enterprise doesn't feature in what you're doing quite a bit. And I really like that aspect, because I think a lot of people who try to write in this era always want to try and shoehorn the familiar ships and the familiar characters in as much as possible, and it ends up being overdone. But I think with what you've done is, we hear references to Pike and Kirk, and we see some things with Sarek happening, but it's all done where it makes sense in the narrative that you're trying to tell. And I think you've threaded that needle really well. Was that tough to do?
It isn't in the sense that it's really easy, because I don't think they're the most interesting part of what I'm trying to write. And it's much easier, and it's also a lot easier in a lot of senses to work with your own characters. Yeah. Or characters who exist and have nothing written about them, than to work with characters who everybody knows and loves. Shushu is in Discovery. Admiral Shukar is a named cast member of season 1 of Discovery. If you ever watch the last 2 episodes of Star Trek season 1 Discovery, when Cornwall beams aboard, she beams aboard with a Andorian admiral. That's Shukar. He's named as such in the script.
Okay, I never made that connection.
But we know nothing about him. So I could do what I want with him. He's essentially, I've been given a face and a name, and I get to go wild. And the same with people like, Nagura, for example, or Rittenhouse, or Westcott features in a lot of in some of the TOS novels. But even then, he's just kind of basically a stock Hollywood casting precedent. So when I have introduced fan favorite characters, so for example Sarek, I'm bringing in from the next chapter, Chekhov's coming in, because the author worked with Chekhov as a historian, so Chekhov's memoirs and interviews are important. But I'm not interested in Ensign Chekhov of the USS Enterprise. I'm really more interested in how does Cadet Chekhov feel about going through the academy in an ever more militarized world, which is not the Starfleet he signed up for. So I'll get a bit of that, but especially with Sarek, it's about basically making you understand what he's like if he's not on your side. So, so Sarek is just basically, the author doesn't consider him to be a particularly, principal political actor, and that basically he thinks Sarek uses Vulcan logic to just get what he wants. Which, you can argue he does.
Sure, yeah.
But basically that he knows he can masquerade and, this is logical, how can you not do it, to just basically support his own political stances. Sarek brings down Broadhurst because he goes, people are like, he had the right idea, and he goes, but he did it in a really illogical manner, and everyone goes, yeah, that's kind of true. And other things like, there's a thing I need to finish writing, which is a series of, basically it's season 2 of Strange New Worlds, told through letters between Rittenhouse and Nagura. And all of them are basically, Rittenhouse has it in for Pike. He thinks Pike shouldn't have command of the Enterprise and wants him sacked. Because basically because Pike doesn't think that the sun shines out of Rittenhouse's arse. There's nothing else to it except sheer personality politics. But as part of it, exploring the Sarek idea is that he basically considers Spock to be a child of nepotism. Which is basically, in the 21st century, if you call someone a child of nepotism, you have to explain what you mean by nepotism, because nobody really knows what it means anymore. But it's basically, if I introduce existing characters, I want it to be in the way that a historian might talk about a famous figure. So when, because I can't not end up talking about Jim Kirk, right? Because he ends up as, he saves the galaxy twice. 3 times, technically. Well, multiple times in TOS. But basically, there'll be a lot of the author going, I don't need to tell you what Jim Kirk does on Organia, because there's a book about it. There's 3 books about it. He wrote it in his autobiography. I'm bringing it up here to make this point.
Yeah.
And when I get to him as Admiral Kirk, I have to justify talking about him to basically go, Admiral Kirk is a symptom of Starfleet trying to reshuffle what Starfleet is. And Nagura puts him in charge of Starfleet operations because he knows Jim Kirk doesn't want to be an admiral. And he knows that actually Nagura can run Starfleet operations while still being Commander Starfleet. Which is why Kirk is so miserable in the job, because he's not actually doing anything.
Yeah.
But I really don't like using existing characters. I might cite them once or twice as a source to be like, well, this is X. And it XYZ based on a draft paper written by Captain Noonien Singh XYZ, just basically like, just as like a, hey, look, that's nice. But I'm deeply uninterested because it's not really about them. I want people to be introduced to new characters and new angles on who exists in this universe. I want people to understand what civilians are doing, what the merchant navy is doing, what politicians are doing.
Well, that adds to the realism.
I want people to understand that Niels Barris was the hero of his era and the greatest president the Federation never had. That's what I say I want. I want people to understand that Niels Barris is such an asshole to Kirk in Trouble with Tribbles because Niels Barris has people breathing down his neck and knows if he screws up on Sherman's planet, the whole strategy in the region might just fall apart. And that he has every right to be as angry as he is about the whole thing. Because Kirk just isn't taking him seriously. I want people to understand that Robert Fox is so blasé about Eminar and Vendikar because the Eminari are passing intelligence to the Klingons. So he doesn't trust them. But he also knows that Starfleet needs to get the trade port. And, and I want people, the other one is that Nancy Hedford from Metamorphosis, whose basically character exists to be rude and then have her body possessed by a cloud, which is terrible. I have them rewriting her into one of the most important politicians of the decade. In many senses, her death, for lack of a better word, with Zephyr Cochrane is the equivalent of the RFK assassination. It is the Federation is the equivalent of losing that important next stage of the political landscape, that she's just gone. And that has massive effect. I want people, I'm not, as such, when I'm borrowing a lot of characters from the original series and the Strange New Worlds, they're often the people you see 10, 20 minutes of. It's, Matt Decker might be the character we see the most screen time of I focused on.
Yeah.
Because I know where his journey ends, so I have to make you... And also, in many senses, he's a clean slate, because the only Decker we see is a Matt Decker who's been broken. We never see the Decker that Spock thinks he's handed command over, or the Decker that Kirk thinks he's gone to save. We only see the one who's kind of lost everything.
Right.
We never see the Matt Decker that Willard Decker is trying to live up to in the motion picture.
Well, and that almost adds an element of tragedy to show what he was, and then you get to the Doomsday Machine and you see what he's become.
Yeah, and there's a certain sense in which I put Decker in as a main character because everybody knows what happens to him.
Yeah.
And it's, I've got most of my invented characters live to grand old ages and retire and have meaningful lives because most people retire at meaningful lives. Some people get killed in action. Most people don't, but also most people don't die dramatically. Most people don't fade away, go out that way. I mean, I have Agatha Drake, the sort of arc figure of Starfleet in the first part of the book. She just gets gets killed in a shuttle accident. Shuttle gets caught in an asteroid field and loses shield integrity and is destroyed. Because that just happens to people. I mean, it happened all the time during the Second World War. People were killed in plane crashes, and it's just that's my attitude. Sometimes you just lost figures like that, and it was no fault of their own or any other power. It's just accident.
Well, and that kind of dovetails in with what you said earlier about not every thread needs to be neatly resolved, neatly tied off, because that doesn't happen in the real world.
I mean, the interesting one is I kind of leave it up to the audience as to whether or not the Klingon, whether or not the Klingon social reform and reformation, sort of cultural revolution, is good or not. Because we know how it ends. It ends in this sort of honor-focused, warrior, stagnant aristocracy of TNG. But is there a pass between the sort of hyper-militarism of TOS and Undiscovered Country? And that, I sort of leave it up to the audience, because the author doesn't know, because I put the author's time of writing before the Klingon Alliance. He's writing between Narendra 3 and the Second Khitomer Alliance. So he doesn't know that the Federation is about to become an ally of the Klingon Empire. He just knows that they're sort of friends now.
Yeah.
Sort of, it's sometimes. Well, the interesting thing, of course, is that that's not particularly normal for historians. Historians don't like. The whole point of history is that it is built on bias. You have a bias, you have an argument you're trying to make to the audience, you convince them of it. You tend not to leave room for them to come up with their own conclusions unless you are doing it on purpose. You've got a point to make, you're using evidence to make that point, you made a conclusion based on it. You don't really, your audience might criticize it, but you're not really leaving room for them to come up with their own answer, because that's not really how history works.
Yeah. Well, and it's, you kind of think, the expression that, history is written by the victors, too, because that definitely, there's a spin, and there's a bias implicit to all of that, right?
Mm. And it's interesting how I put the spin into the writing in subtle ways. Like, the author, Devenish, really, really doesn't like John Gill. John Gill cited as this great historian in the original series who, accidentally turned a planet into a bunch of Nazis. And the author really doesn't like him. And the author kind of doesn't like Tharick or Siobhan Tilly either. Definitely doesn't like Baruco. Seems a lot keener on. It's very mean to L'Rell. Like, basically doesn't think L'Rell. Largely, the author doesn't think L'Rell told a single. Was well intentioned, but never told the truth to anyone. And also didn't understand the force that she was unleashing. And it's interesting, sometimes people are like, oh, why did you say this? Or this is incorrect. Or, shouldn't the author have this attitude? It's like, well, he's got his own biases. I mean, the great Eric Zinhad, Starfleet History on Twitter, Eric, always comes up with me for being too anti-Klingon. But also, within Edge of Midnight, that's kind of the point. Like, the author doesn't particularly think the Klingons have the right attitude and that they were overtly aggressive, and they did have it coming. They were gunning for the Federation. Because he is a Federation historian writing in the 2330s, at a time when the Klingons at least in my head, are a bit more aggressive than they've been since Kittimer. They're caught in a conflict with the Romulans. Starfleet is for those who've read We Have Engaged the Borg, it sort of fits into how Andy and Eric have imagined Starfleet demilitarizing itself at the time, in that the author's basically trying to turn around and go, we can't rely on the Federation being friends to the Klingons forever, and we can't rely on Starfleet being allowed to be complacent about its defense. And in that sense, the author is vindicated by 359 and the Cardassian War and the Dominion War, which will happen afterwards. But he doesn't know that. We do, which is a fascinating bit in many senses, in that the reader of Edge of Midnight understands more about the world and the history than the historian, in air quotes, because they're an external observer.
So you, if I understood what you just said right, when you were writing as Devenish, you're actually building in, I don't know if bias is the right word, but the bias of what's happening in the present time with the Klingons that he's exposed to, and he is looking through that lens as he's studying the events leading up to this moment in time.
Yeah, and it's very subtle, because it kind of has to be, and it also allows me to hand wave when the attitude's basically when it contradicts itself. Because there are contradictions, because I'm not writing this particularly professionally. I do this for fun. So there are contradictions sometimes in the text about the Klingons and their attitudes and their politics. And they can be justified as the author basically sometimes just ignoring his own conclusions to make a point. Because all authors do that, especially historians, especially popular historians. They exclude evidence. The author, Eric has made the point to me that, there's no proof that the Klingons actively engaged and support slavery. It's something I made up. And I was like, yeah, I did, because it fits with how I think the Empire should work. But it also fits with how Devenish wants you to understand the Klingons and what things they're willing to do for their own success. There might be another historian who argues that the slavery with the Orion slavery and the Sulaban slavery wasn't that important. But the fact is that Devenish devoted a whole chapter to talking about it, because that's what he sees as important. And he wanted an obvious point about how it might not be as important to everyone else. Sulaban slavery is never mentioned by any character on Star Trek, because I invented the obvious reason is I invented it. But the in-universe reason might be it's not considered an important historiographical event in the Next Generation era.
You mentioned, that this is just a project. This is for fun, right? It's not your job. Yeah. Is there a part of you that wishes or hopes at some point that somebody with the right pull might look at this and say, "Ooh, we need to bring him in"?
It sort of exists in the back of my mind as a vain, wishful hope. I mean, when I finished the first book, I did look at shopping it around, but my base conclusion was, having spoken to people in publishing and people who published with Trek before, that it wouldn't be the same afterwards.
Sure. Simply
because of the nature of intellectual property rights, but also how they'd want it, what they'd want of it, what would have to happen to it to get it in the publishing space, whether to be published even after that, would be difficult.
Gotcha.
What it exists as in that sense now is it's sort of like a big, insane portfolio piece, in that if somebody's like, "Oh, have you done any Trek writing, any writing like this before?" It's like, not officially, but this exists. And this is a thing, and this is the thing people have liked. I'm aware that people involved with Star Trek as intellectual property on the production side have read it. I'm also aware that various people who work on the Hill at Congress have read it, which is insane. I don't know who. I've just been told, which is insane.
That's
I know
crazy.
at least one person who works. It is crazy. I know a fair few people in both the U.S. Navy and the British Navy, Royal Navy have read it, just anecdotally. I know plenty of historians have read it, which is equally a surprise. So it's just nice, this portfolio piece of writing. I suspect that if someone was like, John, we'd like you to write something like this in Star Trek, I'd turn around and do the Dominion War, which would kill me, but I'd do it. I think it would be insane, but that's what I'd do. Sure. Either that, or I'd do something set, like during or after the Archer presidency, just go through a completely hermetically sealed period no one's ever touched before, and just flesh it out as much as I can as a foundational stone for other people or something. But this, as it exists, I doubt will ever be published. Mm-hmm. But that's what people thought about the Klingon language. That's what people thought about a lot of the facet designs and a lot of stuff that people never intended to end up canon in Star Trek have ended up being canon in one way or another. I mean, literally, you look at Picard Season 3 and the Constitution 2 class, I don't think Bill Krause designed the Shangri-La expecting it, or an iteration of it, to ever end up on the screen, but it did. So I'll never say never. But as it stands now, I write this because I like writing it. And I write it because people like to read it. And it keeps my head busy. I started writing this in lockdown because it kept me busy and it sort of exercised the historical thinking and writing and muscles. So it keeps me going that way. And I've also... I've started, now I've finished. I will get as far as the Organian War. Will I get all the way to Khitomer? I don't know, but I've told myself I'll get to Organia. And I expect once I get to Organia, I'll go, okay, I'm going to go as far as Genesis now. And then I'll go as far as Genesis, and then I'll go to Khitomer. But I don't expect to get there until, it's taken me 3 years to do from 2256 to 2261. Right. God knows how long it'll take me to get to Khitomer. I'll be in my 30s. In many senses, even if I get to Organia and stop there, I'll be satisfied. Because I'll have done something nobody's really done at all. You look at, sort of one of the slight inspirations of this is publishing house run by a friend of mine called Sea Lion Press, who publish exclusively alternate and speculative history. Mm-hmm. And a lot of that is also a lot of it is prose in the style of people like Harry Turtledove. But a lot of it is this sort of non-narrative academic style where you have alternate history written with footnotes and sources and bibliographies in this style. So it's not like there isn't a market and appeal for this. It's just not a very large one. But then again, you've got the series of character autobiographies, and they're all brilliant. I've really enjoyed reading Autobiography of Benjamin Sisko. So it's not like this kind of non-traditional Star Trek book hasn't been published.
Right.
I just don't expect it to happen anytime soon to me.
Yeah. Well, no, I think you're absolutely right that this particular flavor of book is something that a lot of people do crave. Like I said, those books that are written as if they exist within the universe are some of my favorite. So,
I've always been surprised how many people really like this. I mean, I went to Star Trek Las Vegas this year with Andy, who runs Wolfhouse 339, and Hai, who does the Oniaka 3 project, and I think we were all quite pleasantly shocked and surprised at how many people were really really keen on the idea, really, really interested, and really, really wanted to know what we were doing next and how I could help and what they could do. And that was quite the number of people who just kind of put their head, came around the table, say hello, I really enjoyed it, who had never heard of us before and took one of our pamphlets, or simply came up to me at the bar and went, "This is really cool." I think a lot about Aaron Wilkie turning around to me at about 11:30 on a Saturday, going, "Why don't you work for me?" And I was like, U.S. visa laws, I guess.
I mean, yeah, there's that.
There's that, but it's people. I think people do have an appetite for this, and it's a lot of getting this out there and getting this out there, and has relied on word of mouth and spreading from friend to friend and person to person. So I'm, coming and talking to it, and trying to sort of talking about it and spreading what we're doing with this, and Tranquility Press overall has been quite sort of like, I've done this thing, people have enjoyed it, I want more people to enjoy it. That's sort of all I want out of it now. Right. You want to support me and you read it, go give it to your friend who might be interested, or if you're ever in London, buy me a drink, I don't know. But generally, I just, right now it's all about giving people something to enjoy, because that's been at the heart of fandom and Star Trek fandom for so long, is people doing stuff just for others to independently enjoy and love. It would be nice to be paid 20 quid a pop every time somebody bought it, but for now I'll just take a nice message or a nice email being about, or a tweet even, about how much you're enjoying it, because that's just kind of like, that's done. I can pay my bills in other ways for now. Right now I just want people to enjoy it and be inspired. It's nice. I've had people tell me that they've started writing similar things because they've read this and didn't realize they could write this stuff, and people be interested. And that's just as nice to hear as this is really good. In fact, sometimes it's even nice to hear I've done my own thing, because anyone can, if you like it, write it. Right. You should.
Yeah, absolutely. So I have a Discord channel that's part of my Patreon perks, and I was mentioning in that channel that I was talking to you about this, and I put some screenshots of the book, and one of the guys was like, "Oh my god, this is amazing. There are even footnotes." And he was just, he was so excited by that. Bit.
Well, the footnotes are my favorite thing. It's always fun to come up with new footnotes. I like to sneak friends, Twitter mutuals, etc. into the footnotes. But also, footnotes are a great piece of of world building, because they're like, what are other people writing about? What is it? It's all the best world building is the backdrop it's a backdrop on a stage. It is a painting of a building, and I know it's not a building. I know it's not a building. Everyone on the stage knows it's not a building. But it's good enough as a building that you can think, yeah, they're really in a town. Because, I'm not going to go, I've made footnotes about other books or articles. I'm not going to write those articles. No one's going to write those articles. Because some of them are no one's going to write an article about the social dynamics of Klingon colonies near the Federation border. Because, I might. But you get my point, which is, I'm not going to take time to write that. But the idea that it's out there, propping this up, is great. And I think I'm glad people really appreciate the footnotes, because sometimes I spend my time being literally aligning the footnote style so they all match, like an actual academic work. And does anybody read these?
Yes.
But they do. So
it adds to the immersion. It adds to, I think, the reality and just the illusion of what you're doing. And I think it's a great touch.
Because of course the TNG Tech manual has footnotes.
So the Business of Risk is out there now.
Business of Risk you can download if you Google The Edge of Midnight Star Trek. Generally, so if you Google The Edge of Midnight, you get a Miley Cyrus song, which is good for her. It's
not
really
the same thing.
Not the same thing. If you Google Edge of Midnight Star Trek.
So what I'm planning on doing is I'm going to throw the link to your website in the description when I post this, as well as your social media handles and things like that. So anybody watching this who's super interested can find you and keep up to date.
Yeah. So, yeah, if you Google Edmund, it's a website, and the website has a link to a PDF of the first book, the audiobook of the first book, read by the excellent and gem Stephen Van Doren, who, when the PDF came out, just went, "I'd like to read the whole thing," and did. And Stephen, you are one of the absolute gents. And
That's fantastic.
Unbelievably great reading. He does a great Shran impression in the first chapter, if you're into that. But also, the website has a lot of additional supporting material. So it's got organization charts, list of starships. It's got profiles on lots of the main political figures. It's got some side articles on things like deep space logistics, some of the task forces. That interview I mentioned about Ambassador Dakra. There's also a game. I built a Twine game on there, which allows you to step in the shoes of President Westcott and try and prevent war. It's not finished, but it's worth a try. But the website has links to all that in the first book, but it also, more importantly, has to start the first 4 chapters of the second book.
Oh, fantastic.
The second book, The Arsenal of Freedom, which currently leads you into the Acamar crisis, which is sort of the October Cuban Missile Crisis of the early Cold War. It's a moment where it all becomes very real for everyone. And I'm writing, that is being written as I go. So that's available on the website just in text. I'm working on doing some nice PDF versions of that. But that comes out as it goes. So follow the please look at the website. Follow me, I say us, it's me, on Twitter, the Hell site, because I do a lot of side posting on there about various concepts and ideas. I've done some great videos I've just edited together from various clips, which have been great fun to do, just to make things feel a bit more. Just a lot of the Twitter is me just sort of thinking of ideas and putting them with pictures and sort of speculating on what the world would be like. But it's a nice way to get immersed with what Edgemondite is outside of the text. But I do really, really want people to look at the website because I've put a lot of love and investment to it. It's also, you can see a lot of the wonderful art and renders that have been done for the book. I'm, in this age of AI art and all that things, I'm always incredibly grateful to and incredibly supportive of all the artists I've worked with, because they are fantastic and imaginative, and they say, I go things like, well, I want a picture, I want a portrait of, Sturka in a Klingon pose. Well, why don't we put Lorella on the flag like Lenin? And why don't I go for this Goshardt star so it looks like a Soviet poster? And I'm like, this is incredible. Keep doing this. Or working with Pundus to do renders of starships, where I can say, can you do this starship? And it will just appear on screen. It's like, yeah, I can do that. So support your artists.
Definitely.
And credit your artists as well. And pay them well. I think every pound I've spent on art has been worth it. Absolutely. But yes, please look at the website, which link below.
Yeah, I think. It'll be there. Okay, so first 4 chapters of book 2 are out there. Arsenal of Freedom, right?
Mm-hmm. Yep.
At this point, are you shooting for a date when book 2 is going to be locked and loaded, or is it just kind of as it goes?
Book 2 goes when book 2 goes. I wasn't really committed to the timing for when book 1 ended. I should point out that the original intention was to do the whole Klingon War in one book, the whole Cold War in one book. As you can see, that went out the window very quickly. But I do know Arsenal of Freedom, the last chapter will be the Organian War. I know what the last line of the book is. When that happens, I don't know. I'm doing a master's degree now that has slowed the speed of writing down a bit. It moves and fluctuates, but I know that I will probably estimate and say I will have a full book. If I end up writing at the same rate I wrote the first one, end of next year. Yeah. Probably. Maybe a bit after. It depends. Once again, I don't get paid to do this,
yeah.
so. And also, to be quite frank, I write more when I know people are reading it.
Yeah.
So tell me you're reading it, everyone, because then I'll write it. Tell me you're reading it. I don't think it's actually. I'm going to change the website. So by the time this goes up, there will be a link on the website to the Discord channel where you can come and chat to me and others. And I put hints and I bounce ideas off people. There's a whole fun channel in there where I talk about what actors I cast as characters. What's the last one in here? Oh yeah, it was that if I was doing Ken Westcott for Stranger Worlds, it would be Dule Hill, which I think was an inspired choice. Putting Dule Hill up against Anson Mount, I think Dule Hill against Anson Mount, I think would work quite well.
Yeah. Get the right people to read that, and maybe it'll happen.
Oh God, yeah. Don't threaten me with a good time. But yeah, so support, come and read it. Tell me what you think on Twitter. Tell me what you think of it in the Discord. Email me about it. That's always nice to read the real email these days.
Yeah.
But it feels bad to be like, it gets done when it gets done.
No.
But it is very much an element of, I don't get paid to do this. You don't have to, and more importantly, you don't have to pay to read it.
Right.
So many times people are like, where do I buy this? Especially when physical editions have existed, don't tell the lawyers. People have buy those. I didn't do a lot of those with friends and supporters. It's free to read.
Right.
It will always be free to read. It will always be free to download. I'm very grateful to Heimadikian, who did the fantastic typesetting and rendering for Bits of Risk, and we'll be probably doing it again for Ask the Freedom. Hi also did 359, so if you've enjoyed that, so there will always be these well-presented PDFs whenever I finish blocks. I will probably actually, once I finish the current chapter, do the first 5 chapters of Arsenal of Freedom as a block for people to read, nicely presented, because that's something like 60,000 words. I feel like people would enjoy being able to read that nicely. So, but come read it. Support it by sharing it. Support it by telling your friends about it. I don't know what else to say except if you've read it, I'm very grateful. If even one person more has read it because of this, I'm grateful because I spent a lot of time on it.
Yeah, I mean, it's clear just from reading through it that this is very well thought out and very well written. So I think it's an amazing project. I'm really excited to keep on reading. I've read it 1.5 times already. So, and it's been great having you. So I want to thank you for coming on and talking about it.
Oh, thank you very much. It's an absolute pleasure. And that's the thing I said earlier. I just want to try. It's sort of occurred to me that I spend a lot of time talking about this on Twitter, and I should that's the whole other audience of Trekkies who aren't on the site of doom, who I'd like to talk to us about. And I'd like them to know that stuff like this exists. And it's, I've mentioned my colleagues before, said again that, what the other 3 of us at Tranquility Press are trying to do and promote this kind of not just reading, but also people to write their own stuff. I think it's important that, fandom is not just about consuming media, it's about creating your own and enjoying what other people create.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, John, thank you so much for your time. Not just for this, but also the 3 years you put into Business of Risk and all that. I look forward to seeing what comes next. And if you all are watching out there, go visit his website.